Hello everybody, how are you doing today? I hope you're doing well and I hope your reading is going well. Today we're going to do something a little bit different and I'm going to be reacting to 1-star reviews of some of my favourite books. Now, when it comes to great literature, I personally like to discuss the books that I love and why I love them, but I'm all too aware that many of my personal favourite books of all time could very well be the books that other readers despise more than anything in the world. And when you have a favourite book, you feel very personally invested in other people also enjoying that book. When you cherish a certain book, it's typically because it contains a little piece of you, or it reflects something of you. It reflects something of you at a specific moment in your life. And so if somebody doesn't like your favourite book, it's almost like they don't like you. But I am very understanding when it comes to many of my favourites, because indeed, with many of them, I initially didn't like them either. And part of the reason why I love them so much now is because of that experience of going from originally not liking them at all to many years later falling deeply in love with them. So I have a healthy handful of 1-star reviews for some of my favourite books. Now, I haven't seen these reviews and I don't even know the books that are up for discussion because I have asked my editor to select them for me. She's gone and she has curated some 1-star reviews from Goodreads, so this will be my genuine first reaction. And if these reviews do not dissuade you from tackling these big books, then we have guided readings, lectures and rich discussion for many of them at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, which is at patreon.com/hardcore literature. Now, let's dive into the reviews. Oh look, good. We're starting with Moby Dick, or The Whale, by Herman Melville. This is one of my favourite books of all time. I utterly adore this work for the reason that Ray Bradbury said. He put it so beautifully when he said that Shakespeare wrote Moby Dick using Melville as a Ouija board. Now, I have a good friend who has a big book for his reading project each and every year. Last year, it was George Eliot's Middlemarch. This year, it's Moby Dick. And he messaged me and said that he was surprised at how much he was loving it. The last time he read the book was when he was much younger, a child or a teenager, and it is a completely different book many years on. And I said that I personally had the same experience. When I first read Moby Dick, I was very, very young and I was blown away by the musicality of the prose. I was swept away by that first chapter, Loomings, Call Me Ishmael. And then it got to the encyclopedia entries, the procession of encyclopedia entries to do with whaling, and yes, I abandoned the book. Many years later I came back to it and it felt like a completely new experience, and I realised that I had changed. And Moby Dick is definitely one of those books that rewards those of us who have experienced intense change. In fact, the book itself was born out of a really dark place in Herman Melville. He wrote Moby Dick because he couldn't go to sea. He wanted to get to sea, but when he couldn't and he couldn't afford to go on a grand tour like many of his peers, he contented himself by going on that voyage in his mind, and he created the Pequod. He created Captain Ahab, and interestingly, Captain Ahab wasn't there in the first draft of the book. What happened is Melville started writing this work out of a place of despair and despondency, and then he went to the public library, got himself a large print edition of the complete works of Shakespeare, found himself mesmerised by King Lear and Macbeth and Hamlet, and Moby Dick as we know it, and the monomaniacal Captain Ahab who raises his fist aloft and threatens to strike the sun if it insults him. That was born. Let's take a look at that first review. How can a book that's almost entirely set in the ocean be this dry? I can completely understand why somebody might find the book to be quite dry, and that's part of the difficulty with literature that has a very strong and sharp sense of irony. I couldn't really assimilate the novels of Jane Austen when I was much younger, and that causes me some pain to think about today, because today I pick up Pride and Prejudice and I am laughing, and there aren't too many works that pull laughter out of me. Irony is all about not really saying what you mean and not meaning what you say. And Shakespeare's a master of it, Austen is a master of it, and Ishmael, who is the mouthpiece for Herman Melville, is also a master of it. Let's check out the next review. This one's a little bit longer. Moby Dick is one of the worst, most disappointing experiences of my life. I started it in February 2006 and was so utterly bored that I didn't finish it until May ... of the next year. That seems like a really good reading length to me though. I actually read really slow, and if I enjoy a book, I do not want to put it down. So for me, taking over a year to get through Moby Dick sounds like a treat, but this person took a year perhaps because they didn't want to read the next page and delayed it and delayed it. I felt so cheated. This was the greatest classic of all time, the book everybody talks about. It even made me question myself as a reader. Maybe I had misunderstood or done something wrong. I even felt stupid. But after thinking a lot about it, I realised the book is one big freaking joke. Yeah, so Moby Dick is interesting. I think a lot of people do talk about it, and it's one of the books that I get the most people telling me about. When readers want to gush to me about a certain book, it is typically Moby Dick. But I certainly do hear from readers who didn't enjoy it, and I think it's quite a popular book to tear apart. But this reviewer says something that I think we can all relate to. It made me question myself as a reader. Maybe I misunderstood or done something wrong. Nobody wants to feel that way. And that is one of the difficulties when it comes to big books, books that are dense with allusions, references to other literature, antiquated language, and even thematic difficulty. Because once you penetrate past the poetic prose and the elusive prose of Moby Dick, you find that what Melville is wrestling with, yes, there's great humour, it's very funny. What he's wrestling with is existential crisis. And that can be a difficult thing to confront too, but we do not want to feel stupid with these books, and I completely relate. Before I went to university, I never really questioned my intellect. I loved reading difficult books, philosophy, poetry, and I was most certainly in the minority. I even felt very lonely because my friends, my peers, didn't want to read these books, didn't want to talk about them. When I got to university, however, it went from one extreme to another, and suddenly I was questioning my intellect. Every waking moment I felt intellectually insecure, as did many of my friends there, because everything was a debate. Everything was a rigorous debate, and it gets exhausting. And after a few years, once I graduated, I completely abandoned reading and literature. And there was an element when it came to academic study of we would sit in these tutorials and one would definitely question whether we even loved these books, because all it really seemed like we were doing was trying to damn the writers or over-intellectualize, very often intellectualizing things that didn't need it. And I had a little crisis moment, because literature was something that kept me company when I was younger and I was lonely. And suddenly, that comfort, that thing that had meant so much to me, something that had connected me to the most important people in my life, like my grandmother, who got me in to Dickens and Shakespeare and Tolkien. She got me into a wide variety of books, and suddenly I didn't want to read anymore because it made me feel stupid. Now, one of the most liberating mindsets that I had after graduating was, it's okay to not understand. And I told myself this, and this is absolutely key to unlocking the power of really difficult books. Ulysses is another example, because I personally, over the course of my reading years, have been back and forth on that one. There were moments where I thought, this is rubbish, this is a joke, and I said very much the same things that this reviewer is saying about Moby Dick. But once you tell yourself, hey, you do not need to understand everything, suddenly you realise how much you do understand and appreciate. It's like a little Jedi mind trick. But let's go on with the review. It starts off telling you about all these interesting mysteries around the ship's captain and the big white whale, which is actually pretty good. Suddenly you start reading all this very almost painful detailed descriptions of every single part of the whale. There's actually a chapter called the eye. Yeah, and don't forget about the procession of quotations that begins, that kicks off the story. Those epigraphs, they're there for a very important stylistic reason. They kind of create the effect of the whale before you've even gotten to the story. It's looming on the horizon, this Leviathan. But absolutely, this is definitely one of the reasons why so many readers will abandon Moby Dick. Understandably so as well. You then find yourself going through almost 800 pages of the most boring thing ever written, and then all of a sudden you realise you're in the last page. This one actually contains a little bit of the story, but it ends so abruptly and so badly that you feel stunned and stupid. I'd say the very last chapter, or the last few chapters of Moby Dick, are some of the most sublime and powerful and lyrical and resonant that I've ever come across myself. But again, I do get where this reader is coming from, totally. In the end, you only read, and I'm not exaggerating, like 50 pages of actual story, and the rest is biological documentation. Now, this is really interesting. So we're hitting upon some points why readers may not take to certain big books, certain books that are lauded as the greatest of all time. One reason is it makes them feel stupid, and another reason is that there's not enough story. And I've wrestled with this myself, and that's part of the reason why with a lot of the prize winners I have a bit of a problem, because what we frequently see is style over substance, yeah? Aesthetic experimentation versus substance. And I think we want both, don't we? At least I want both. I want a story that's a powerful story, and I want it beautifully told. And I want to be intoxicated by the prose itself, but it cannot just be that. There has to be story, there has to be character, there has to be conflict. I personally think that there is a lot of that in Moby Dick, but the procession of, like this reader says, biological entries is like a mist or a fog shrouding all of that. It's a big book and it's a sublime book, but it's also very, very subtle, and I think it's very easy for a lot of it to go completely unapprehended, and indeed that was the case in Melville's lifetime. Melville was posthumous, really. It wasn't until he had been passed away for a while that we actually started to study his works. He wasn't appreciated in his lifetime. Very much like Emily Dickinson as well. Let's go on with the review. It's almost towards the end. It was definitely a huge letdown. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone unless you hated them and wanted to make them suffer. Even then, I doubt anyone is as masochistic as I am. I mean, most people would have given up by page 200. So I couldn't help it. I had to just get down my work copy of Moby Dick. I actually have many copies of Moby Dick. This one means a lot to me. This is a very cheap Wordsworth Classics paperback. It means a lot to me because it's absolutely covered in my scrawlings, my marginalia, and it's got a little piece of me at a moment in time. The interesting thing is my entrance to this work was definitely through the lyricism, and it was through the Shakespearean allusions and so forth, and I found it funny. Another entrance for me was through the Byronic, monomaniacal Captain Ahab. Another entrance was the bromance, if you like, between Ishmael and Queequeg. How Melville depicts fraternal love, brotherly love, is really touching, really touching. But in recent times, I have actually found that those biological entries, the encyclopedia entries, yes, those are rather dry parts of the work. I've found that I have started to be more interested in them, however, and that's purely from a sort of ecological standpoint. I've found myself very interested in the subject matter itself because it is about marine life. Yes, it's about hunting after something, it's about meaning, it's about God, it's about the soul, it's about all of these things and more, but it's also about marine life. You could read this as an ecological novel. But absolutely, what I would say to anyone who had this sort of negative reaction to Moby Dick is that's absolutely fine and understandable, and actually that would unite you with many readers who now love Moby Dick. So when it comes to these big works, there's never a right or wrong time to come to them. In fact, when you come to them is the right time, and sometimes you can't force that. If it were me having that reaction, I'd put it back on the shelf and I'd continue reading many different other works, and I'd return to it. in the future, especially if you had an extreme negative reaction to a work, because that in itself is quite valuable. Let's go on to the next review. I see the title, it is Frankenstein. Okay, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I love this work. I absolutely adore this work. We had this as our Halloween read in the Hardcore Literature Book Club the year before last. Last year was Bram Stoker's Dracula. Here's the review. There was just nothing I liked about this book. The only notes I wrote down about this while I was reading are as follows. Man creates man. Man runs from responsibility. Created man does crimes. Created man says, I wouldn't do crimes if I had a girlfriend. They're actually really good cliff notes. I was going to write a whole thing about this and why I didn't like it, but finishing the audiobook felt like it took a million years, and I don't want to spend more time thinking about it than I have to. Mary Shelley, I respect you and your contribution to the literary canon. I hate this book. I respect you, Mary Shelley. I hate this book. I hated it when I read it in high school, and I still hate it. This book killed my desire to get back into reading. It made me so mad and annoyed, and I just hate it. I can't believe I even finished it at all. Okay, I think we're hitting upon another reason. Now, obviously there's going to be several reasons why this reader didn't like Frankenstein, but I think it's important to note that high school has been mentioned. Oh my goodness, how difficult is it to undo the damage that school did to us when it comes to great books? I love Shakespeare, but if it wasn't for just one teacher in my sixth form, one teacher, I wouldn't have a single positive memory about Shakespeare in all of my schooling. I love Shakespeare, and I detested Shakespeare classes. I would skip them. Now, how on earth would somebody who is ambivalent or not even interested in reading, watching plays generally, how could they abide the way Shakespeare is taught in high school? And it's not just Shakespeare, it is Mary Shelley, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, because Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is superb. It's a superb book, but hey, leave it to the schools to damage it. Thank goodness for those teachers who actually love the books they are teaching, because I think very frequently that's the problem. Yeah, many of my secondary school teachers, they didn't read the book. They were reading from a sort of like a binder that told you about the book, and they didn't care. Luckily, I did have a very good teacher, and he really cared, and passion is key. And if you have a teacher who is incredibly passionate about a work, it almost doesn't matter what that work is. But very frequently, schools do a lot of damage with the way they're teaching these books. And then we have to sit exams on these books. I don't want to get all Dead Poets Society here, but like with great poetry, great literature, we go and sit an exam, and there's a right and a wrong answer. That's not the way we read. That's not the way we read. The cliff notes are correct though. Man creates man, man runs from responsibility, created man does crimes, created man says I wouldn't do crimes if I had a girlfriend. Funnily enough, all of those sentences hit on core themes. It's about creation. Do we have the right to create? Yeah, it's a comment on science, and Mary Shelley at the time was obviously writing when science was taking huge strides forward, but there was also a lot of fear around those strides. Are we playing God? What right do we have to play God? And then you've got responsibility. What responsibility do we have when we create something? This is a conversation that is going to continue to be more and more pressing. We're living in the age of artificial intelligence, aren't we? And we're seeing huge leaps forward with that. And great speculative fiction, which is what Mary Shelley's work is never of its time, it's enduring. And then we've got that sense, that painful sense of petitioning our maker, railing against them. Why did you create me and throw me into a world that does not care for me? Why did you throw me into a world where I'm hated and scorned for who I am, and you don't even give me somebody to keep me company? And that's really painful. I need to reread Frankenstein because it's one of those works that you do change your attitude towards the monster, yeah, and the whole situation. year after year, depending on what you've experienced in your life. So I'm very much looking forward to that. I'm going to be rereading it again this Halloween. And in previous readings, I've found myself getting really choked up and pushed to the point of tears. But yes, I can understand why somebody wouldn't like it, especially if you've read it at school. I'm only just returning to the books that I read at school and finally getting something out of them. Let's go on to the next book. It's Persuasion by Jane Austen, and this is her late autumnal masterpiece, Jane Austen's Persuasion. Tremendous, tremendous work of literature. I have to give it up. I can't do this anymore. At 75% in, I'm no more connected to this story than I was on the first sentence. I have tried, and reading this book feels like chewing sawdust to me. Maybe I will pick it up again one day, a day far, far in the future. It's interesting because 75% of the way in, I actually think that a lot is capitalized upon in the last quarter, in the last 20% of the book. I think a lot is being set up and the payoff is at the end. And we have Anne Elliot give one of the most beautiful Shakespearean speeches on men and women, and are women inconstant? And she says poignantly, "All the privilege I claim for my own sex, it's not a very enviable one, you need not covet it, is that of loving longest when existence or when hope is gone." I personally cherish Persuasion because it was the book that unlocked Austen for me. Returning to that idea of school damaging these books, I read Pride and Prejudice at school and I didn't get on with the teacher, and I also just wasn't at the right age to really understand some of the themes. And it's a very, very funny book, and today I laugh out loud, and I see people who I know in my real life in the characters. Persuasion is kind of like deep cuts Austen, or Austen fans will very frequently come to Persuasion towards the end of their reading journey, after they've read Emma, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Northanger Abbey, once they've read Sense and Sensibility, because it's really subtle. It's really subtle. Anne Elliot is definitely contending for one of the best heroines in Austen's heterocosm. But it is a very subtle work, it's a very quiet work. It was written towards the end of Jane Austen's life, when she was quite ill. It's very, very truthful, and it's a tender meditation on love and loss and life generally, and I think it's really elegant. But of course I understand why somebody may have given up on it. Austen, again, is a writer who does irony very, very well. Yeah, that's her genius. Let's go on to the next review for Persuasion. I found this book painfully long-winded and boring. It has to be, because otherwise the story would take up about 5 pages. I realised the value of this novel is not in the plot, but the interactions and aspirations of its characters. Yeah, so much of great literature, the story is between the lines, yeah? And I find it interesting to always examine the language we use, the metaphors we live by, to appropriate a George Lakoff phrase, because embedded in those cliches and those words that we use in common parlance, we have wisdom. And we talk about reading between the lines, and we do that when it comes to literature too. What's not being said? Yeah, what's the subtext? Iceberg theory. And very often something feels truthful, not for what is contained on the page, but what is left out. Yeah, Tolstoy is a master of this. Hemingway is a master of this. This review goes on. However, I had a hard time caring about any of them, as no one in the book was particularly likeable. None of the women had any personality to speak of, and the main love interest of the book was entirely two-dimensional. Even if I had been able to feel a connection with the characters, the writing style was so difficult to follow, I doubt I could have enjoyed this book. I often found myself having to go back several paragraphs at a time, because even as I read the words, my mind would drift to something else and I'd realise I had no idea what I'd just read. I have enjoyed other authors from this time period, and though I can see how her novels may appeal to some, I personally think Jane Austen is overrated. If you read the other novels from around the time Jane Austen was writing and before, you will mark just how indebted we are to her when it comes to novel writing, when it comes to psychologically complex characters. She really took novels and characters in a really strong, powerful direction. And unfortunately today, it is so easy to take writers who have given us so much for granted because we are so used to their modes, and it can be really hard to see their modes, which now perhaps feel a bit worn out, as original. But she was original, absolutely original. I would say, again, as somebody who took a long time to come around to Jane Austen and now completely loves her work, there are other works that could be your entrance. With great writers, you need to pick the right entrance work. This is also the case with Charles Dickens. It makes a real difference which work you use to get into the author. Because once you've gotten your entrance, you can go back to novels like Persuasion, and you'll have a lot of resources from your reading of their other works to bring in with you. I think it's a real shame that Jane Austen died when she did, because I think we have evidence that she was going in a very exciting new direction, and there most certainly would have been some really fantastic works to come. She wasn't done writing, in my opinion. Okay, next up we have Les Misérables by Victor Hugo, and the review goes like this. War and Peace seemed 1,000 pages too short. This book, unfortunately, seemed 1,000 pages too long. That's really interesting because they make really good complementary reads or companion reads. It's a really great thing to do, to pick Victor Hugo's brick, and I say that with affection, for your big read one year and then do War and Peace next, or vice versa. They're very complementary, and in our most recent lecture on War and Peace at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, we actually did stack Victor Hugo up against Tolstoy to see how these writers approach history. Because Tolstoy, very much like Hugo, believed that at a certain point history must become fictional in order to be truthful. And Tolstoy, like Hugo, was not ultimately subservient to history. Even though the historical detail is tremendous, he was ultimately subservient to the truth. He says in Sevastopol in May that the hero of his story, who he loves dearly, is the truth. And with Victor Hugo, you read his works, and to me it feels incredibly truthful, even if some of the ostensible details have been tweaked, because that is most certainly the case. So that surprises me, because I feel as though if you like War and Peace, you'll like Les Misérables and vice versa. But okay, Victor, the review goes on. Do we really need 4 full chapters about the sewers of Paris and the poetic side of excrement? And are we really supposed to believe that all of the thugs, thieves and murderers and other scoundrels haunting Paris, of all of them, the one guy, Inspector Javert, is really intent on capturing is the guy who stole a loaf of bread 20 to 30 years before? Yeah, I mean, I think the relationship between Javert and Jean Valjean is like the beating heart of the novel. Well, Jean Valjean is the heart of the novel, and I identify a lot with Jean Valjean. Temperamentally, we're kind of the same, but you kind of look at what he's doing and his attitude and you think, mate, you're kind of letting yourself be taken advantage of here. And then you look at Javert, and it really is interesting to experience their trajectories and the character development. But yeah, you kind of think, could you not ease up a little bit? There are worse people to go after. Yeah, I get it, the review says. The French legal system was unfair, but come on, this is ridiculous. Yeah, they have a point, they have a point. Here's another review for Les Mis. Life is miserable, and then you die. I mean, I think, isn't that the tagline for the musical? Let's go on to another book. Now we have War and Peace. Okay, very cool. So at time of recording, we are doing a guided reading of War and Peace, and the response has been tremendous. The discussion around this book is unlike anything I've ever seen before. Readers are loving this book. We have a really nice mix of people who are rereading the book for the second, third, fifth, 10th time, and we have first-time readers. And what's really cool is seeing that so many first-time readers are saying, I can't believe how accessible this work is, how immersive it is, because it has a really daunting reputation, doesn't it, War and Peace? But we're absolutely loving it and we're getting so much out of it. If you want to join in and you're not already reading along with us, then navigate over to patreon.com/hardcore literature. Let's check out some of these one-star reviews of War and Peace. I sincerely doubt that I will ever read this book again, or ever feel any desire to. I can certainly see how and why it has secured its place as part of the canon, but I did not find the characters and their lives compelling enough to overcome the annoyance I felt with Tolstoy's personal vision of history and life. Yes, and this is a very, very common thing that readers say. Even the readers who love War and Peace will say this. Tolstoy will take a step back from the narrative, and of course his personal voice intrudes into the narrative itself. He comes through in what the characters say, but he'll take a step back and he'll give us these interpolated didactic essays on history. Mumblings, as my friend said. Very, very funny, yes. Mumblings on history. And you think, Tolstoy, we get it. Andrew Vachtel, in an essay on history and autobiography and Tolstoy, pointed out that Tolstoy needed to be overt with his point of view because he thought that readers would miss what he was trying to do. And he wanted readers thinking about free will, determinism, you know, meaning, all this sort of thing. And he worried that if he wasn't really on the nose, they would miss it. Of course, that wouldn't be the first time that readers would miss something. There's a huge gulf between author intention and how the readers actually experience the work. We know this with James Joyce, that's understandable. Samuel Richardson discovered this with his long, sprawling epistolary Clarissa. He found that readers were siding with the antagonist. They would go to the coffee houses to discuss the latest instalment, and they loved Lovelace, who should be the villain, and so he needed to be more overt. He was like, okay, you're not getting what I'm doing here, so I have to be really overt. What really helps if you find that Tolstoy's being a little bit preachy, because that does come through. He is quite preachy. What really helps is if you check out his A Confession. Again, we did this in the book club in the latest lecture. We broke down his A Confession, and what you realise is he really struggled with his belief on almost everything, but especially when it came to faith and God and religion. And what he believes is a lot more complex than what we initially might think. So that's something that's very much worth doing. Let's carry on with this review. There were moments when I came to care about what was going on in the book. I sympathised with Prince Andrei's broken heart and Pierre's search for meaning, and I was genuinely interested in what choice Nikolai would make in regards to Sonia and Maria some of the time. Okay, so this is a really long review, but it does contain spoilers, so I'm going to cherry pick some parts of it, because in case you haven't read War and Peace, I don't want it spoiled for you. Essentially, the reviewer has an issue with the characters, and the thing about the characters in Tolstoy is they are complex. When we first meet them, I don't believe we're supposed to like them. Many first readers will come to War and Peace and they will see what rereaders are saying about the book. They love Pierre, oh, they love Andrei, and they think, really? These characters aren't likeable. But if you keep reading, you realise that there are elements of Tolstoy, there are elements of yourself, and you understand them. You start to sympathise with them. They're flawed. But we're all flawed, aren't we? War and Peace, this reviewer says, is so large that no storyline ever comes to fruition. And instead of being a truly complex epic, it seemed to me that it was only the raw material from which several great books could have been made. Yeah, Tolstoy said over the course of his writing that it was the epic form that made most sense to him when it came to War and Peace. He would consider Anna Karenina to be his first proper novel. And with a proper novel, you have that sense of unity. But I feel like War and Peace works very well as like a grand opera in prose form, a symphony. And I think that Tolstoy expertly interweaves everything and capitalises upon everything that he sets out to do. The review goes on. Without any genuine interest in the characters, I could only hope that War and Peace would be, in some way, intellectually interesting, but I found it even more deficient in this regard. Tolstoy does not believe in free will, great men, the usefulness of rational thought, or military science. I know these things because Tolstoy uses these ideas like a cudgel, beating the reader about the head and shoulders. He does not trust in the reader enough to allow them to draw the ideas from the story, and so makes numerous digressions to explain the same opinion as he just explained 50 pages ago, using almost the same words so often as not. The reviewer ends by saying, "The only other book that has ever produced such a visceral exasperation in me is Atlas Shrugged. Perhaps, as with that book, time will change my opinion of War and Peace, but I am not hopeful." I would be hopeful. I think there are fair points there. I think what this review is hitting upon is there in the book. Tolstoy is overt. He does repeat himself a bit. The characters are flawed, and you might not love them as perfect ideals, but I think that's kind of the point. And I do think this is another one where time will really, really help. I think this is another one that's very much worth introducing time to and return to it. This is also a really great one for reading with a group like we're doing with the Hardcore Literature Book Club, because Tolstoy's thematic concerns are endless and can be quite divisive, and I think that's part of the value of great literature, is having a strong response. The thing about Tolstoy is, and I tell readers this, feel free to disagree with him. That's absolutely fine. He's a master, but Tolstoy himself seemingly disagreed with absolutely everybody, even himself. He looked back on his earlier works and the works from his middle period with scorn. He didn't like them, and he didn't like many great writers, or he professed not to. He became an influence upon himself and then took issue with what he had written. So do feel free to disagree with Tolstoy, because in a sense everybody does a little bit, and I think that's part of the value. It's supposed to be a really thought-provoking read. Now we have another War and Peace review, which begins, ugh. It took 3 years to get through this slog of a book. And I have nothing against Tolstoy, I really liked Anna Karenina, but this story, if you can even call it that, was so boring in parts. Especially the descriptions of battle. Several of the characters were small-minded idiots, and in the end I simply did not care about Andrei, Pierre, or the lot of them. Now granted, Tolstoy had some great things to say about how futile war is. Tolstoy does say some really profound things about war. He's clearly vehemently anti-war, and that's a message that we can always get on board with. The thing about War and Peace that I've noticed is that readers tend to gravitate either more towards the drawing room and the salon, or the battlefield. So some readers will love the battlefield, the descriptions, the military descriptions, the strategy. Others will love the drawing room, yeah, the social politics of high society. My advice is to take the energy of one realm into the other. So if you love the drawing room, then take that energy and read that into the battlefield, because they're kind of the same. The drawing room will read like a battle at times, and the battle will read like petty squabbling about hierarchy and status. They're kind of the same, and that's another comment that is, I think, really profound in War and Peace, is that War and Peace, because they are binaries, they are two sides of the same coin. So they have a lot more in common than we may care to admit. Next book is Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. The review goes like this. I've tried it 3 times. I know people are obsessed with it. I hate everyone in the book, and I just can't care about a book where I actually hate the characters. And sure, I get the interpretation that as terrible as Heathcliff and Cathy are, it's their love that redeems them. And isn't that romantic? No. I can totally understand not liking the characters in Wuthering Heights. They're not likeable. I don't demand that we like every character we come across in great literature. In fact, I think it would be rather dull if we did. And we read a character like Heathcliff, for example, and what we are presented with is a type or an archetype. Heathcliff is a manifestation of dark, violent love, a personification of such violent love. He is a Byronic anti-hero, and he is the kind of Byronic anti-hero up against who we measure all other dark anti-heroes. And the idea of, oh, isn't it so romantic? Maybe not, but there is a real pain there. And even though the work is incredibly symbolic, really richly symbolic, because the thing is, Emily Brontë was a poet novelist. She wrote a novel that only a poet could write. I feel much the same way about Thomas Hardy, whose books I reread endlessly and voraciously. I love Thomas Hardy, but he's a poet turned novelist, and you can see that poetic expression in his novels. By the time he was done with novel writing, of course, he turned to prolifically writing poetry. And the real tragedy, I think, with Emily Brontë is that she only left one novel, one masterful novel. Luckily, she left a fair bit of poetry, but she died very young. She was 30 when she died. And it pains me to think about all the work that we do not have from her. But Wuthering Heights contains one of my favourite expressions of love in all of literature. In chapter 9, when Cathy says, "I am Heathcliff." Cathy says that Heathcliff is more myself than I am. And she says, if all else perished and he remained, I should still continue to be. And if all else remained and he were annihilated, the universe would turn to a mighty stranger. I should not seem a part of it. My love for Heathcliff resembles the eternal rocks beneath, a source of little visible delight, but necessary. I am Heathcliff. Those words really send a chill through me, and they break my heart. There's this idea of, even if I die, I will still continue to be in the one I love. And maybe Wuthering Heights becomes resonant once you've experienced the pain involved in love, in loss, in losing a loved one. And that's when it takes on a new meaning, a new quality. And this reader says that they tried 3 times. This is a very, very common thing that I hear as well. It holds up to rereading, but the curious thing about Wuthering Heights is for many readers, the first few readings, they might not like it. And it's a novel that changes significantly as you change. So it's another one that is very much worth coming back to, even if you didn't like it the first few times you tried it. Another reviewer says, I may have liked this as a teenager. Not so much now. Why is an incestuous, toxic relationship held up as a paragon of romance? Well, it probably shouldn't be. That's probably not what I get out of the book as I read it, as a paragon of romance. Very often with characters we dislike in literature, we may erroneously infer that this is an ideal and that the author is trying to give us something to strive for. And it is very true that some books do have aspirational models, but a lot of literature features characters who we wouldn't want anything to do with in our lives. It's supposed to be vicarious experience, and it's supposed to be escapism, and it's not always supposed to be something that we strive to replicate in our own lives. Certainly not. Okay, we're going to end on a review for one of my favourite books of all time, and that is James Joyce's Ulysses. I think I may need to have a Guinness for this one. Ulysses. Any reader who says to me that they do not understand Ulysses is a reader who I sympathise with, because I have been through that myself. There are many readers who will say that James Joyce is flipping off his reading public and he's making fun of them, he's having a joke at their expense. And I'm not too sure about that. I feel like James Joyce loved his readership intensely. He had a devilish sense of humour. He had a fiendish, thoroughly Irish sense of humour. And he loved joking about taboo subjects. He loved joking about sex and death. And it's funny that today, and a book club member has mentioned this in our recent group reading thread, our book discussion thread. Today, Ulysses now comes with trigger warnings because of the lewd content, which is funny because Ulysses, as you may know, was the centre of a ferocious obscenity trial, and it was censored. You couldn't get it in America, you couldn't get it in the UK. Ernest Hemingway and George Orwell would smuggle their copies of Ulysses in and out of the countries, and James Joyce, yes, it is objectively rather filthy. It's a dirty book. That's what many Irish mothers would say. Oh, that's a dirty book, you can't read that. James Joyce, however, was so progressive for his time, and thank goodness for the women who saved this book. It was those women who were fighting for equal rights, who made sure that this book could be read and could continue to be read, because it is a work of art, it's a masterpiece, it's thought-provoking, a river of pain runs through it. So if you're going through a hard time in your life, if you've lost someone close to you, you may find that James Joyce puts a comforting arm around you. Not only does he put a comforting arm around you, but he's trying to make you laugh. Yeah, Shakespeare did that too. The joke is not on us as readers. The joke is at the expense of the world we've been thrown into. Yes, this world is hard and there's a lot of pain in this world, but let's have a good drink and a good laugh about it anyway. Let's laugh at ourselves, let's laugh at our condition. And that comes through overwhelmingly in James Joyce, and I find it funny that it is being, once again, it's got these warning labels slapped on it today. When they read it in school, it comes with a little warning. Yeah, it's bad, but it's just not as bad as some of the stuff that we are inundated with every single day today. We are absolutely assaulted with way more obscene content than you will find in Ulysses. Let's read the first one-star review. Call me a sentimentalist, but I want to feel something when I read. Literature, or at least this novel, is about the human experience, and being human is nothing if not an experience rife with emotions. Instead, all I felt is anger towards Joyce for thinking he is the smartest, most original and learned man of all time. People have often called Joyce the arranger of Ulysses as opposed to the author, and I think that's apt. This book is a researched thesis project, not a novel. Yeah, the arranger, that's a reference to this idea of retrospective arrangement, yeah? Because indeed, Joyce makes a lot of commentary on history. Is history a nightmare from which we are struggling to awake? Here's the thing, is I really do understand that charge, anger towards Joyce. Joyce is one of those authors who seems to arouse the most anger. I've done it as well. I've thrown Ulysses across the room. By the time I made it to Finnegan's Wake, I had so become comfortable with this idea of not understanding being okay that I just allow it to wash over me. The interesting thing about Finnegan's Wake, by the way, is if you treat yourself to a good audio version, you can kind of understand it. It's not that dense. Ulysses isn't that difficult. Does it benefit from a guide? Yes, it does benefit from a guide. Are you going to understand absolutely everything in the book? No, definitely not. T.S. Eliot didn't and still praised it. Ezra Pound didn't and still praised it. Virginia Woolf read the book, despised it, and then T.S. Eliot implored her to read it again, and then it ended up being an influence upon her writing. I don't believe that Joyce ever thought he was the smartest person in the room. He was actually a very sensitive soul, and he was writing for an audience like him, an audience of grown-up schoolboys, yeah, readers who had a bit of a naughty, smutty sense of humour, but had also read a lot of literature, and a lot of what he's doing in the book is lampooning the literature. Yeah, there's an episode called Oxen of the Sun where you see the genesis of the English language, and you see Joyce utilise different styles from the history of English literature all the way up to the present day. And the comedy arises from the elevated style married to really sort of low and comic and mundane, humdrum, everyday events. I think there is a lot of pain in Ulysses, and it presents a very full-rounded human experience. It's just one day, blown up to epic proportions. As we all do with our lives, we are the heroes in our own lives. And Joyce told us that life is many days, and day after day we walk through ourselves, meeting ourselves. The heart of the novel for me is Leopold Bloom. I think he's an extraordinary character, and he has to go through so much. He's still struggling from losing his son. Yeah, his son Rudy died when he was just 11 days old, and many years later this is still a traumatic thing to him. He's struggling through the fallout of his marriage to Molly. Yeah, they're not intimate anymore. And he's also struggling with hatred, prejudice, yeah, nationalistic fervour directed at him. He walks through this one day and we can see he's yearning to return home in his heart. It's a really painful book, and it's a very funny book, and I think the fact that this book can make me laugh and cry in a single sitting is a real accomplishment. But of course it's a book that requires a lot of explication, and there are so many guides to this book, and scholars can make an entire career out of debating the punctuation on one page in Ulysses alone. Let's go on to the next review. Notable as an experimental novel, and as a reminder that experiments can go terribly wrong. This monster lived on my bookshelf for many years, until I finally forced myself to read 200 pages, egged on by all of those best book of the century plaudits. But in my opinion, The Emperor Has No Clothes. This book is an unreadable disaster. Certainly it is a book that rewards work and rewards a lot of patience, it rewards a lot of effort, and it rewards those of us who are okay with not understanding absolutely everything. It's a book that needs a lot of time and a lot of dedication. I would personally contend that the rewards of Ulysses are proportionate to the effort that we put in, which goes some way towards explaining why so many readers, once they have fallen in love with James Joyce, spend their whole lives endlessly rereading it. But certainly Ulysses can be one of those books where the beginning of the journey, the beginning of your developing relationship with the book looks very far from love. But it's also a book where you can, over time, get past that initial negative reaction to the work and end up having an equally opposite reaction, a positive reaction. And I love it. I absolutely adore it, and I absolutely adore all of these books that have been given 1 star. And if these negative reviews have not deterred you and you're interested in relishing and appreciating some of these works, then we have in-depth content, guided readings and lectures on these books at the Hardcore Literature Book Club at patreon.com/hardcore literature. Thank you so much for watching today, and if you liked this content, let us know and we can do a part 2, because I certainly have many more favourite books that I'm sure have received negative reviews. And it would be good fun to do this again because I enjoyed this video. So thank you again for watching, I hope you have a lovely day, and happy reading everybody. Bye bye for now.